Is there enough political will to develop infrastructure in the continent? How does poor infrastructure affect economic development? What makes Africa one of the most unequal continents in the world? How does people migration to cities like Johannesburg impact infrastructure? What time is it? It's question time. Hello and welcome to Question Time. My name is Mpho Tseli. Efforts towards accelerating Africa's political and socio-economic development continue amid reports revealing that while 6 of the world's fastest economies are in Africa, the continent has 7 of the most unequal economies in the world. For its part, though, NEPAD insists that infrastructure development must dominate agendas of all governments in the continent, since it is key to all aspects of social and economic transformation. But do leaders have the political will to collaborate towards advancing the continent's infrastructural development? My guest today, Adama Dean, Head of Infrastructure Strategic Business Unit at NEPAD, and Nikki Vaima, Senior Economist at Nedbank. Welcome to the program, Mr. Dean. Is there enough political will? Are you finding that the political leaders are paying lip service and perhaps not delivering on the promises they make in as far as infrastructure development is concerned?
Well, I think I would want to say that perhaps you should ask the question whether is there enough technical will. Okay. Because over the years, we've been guided by political will, by our political leaders, and I can cite good examples. Yes. You remember when NEPAD was established in 2001, obviously that was the decision that was taken in Lusaka to bring together African countries, the political consensus around the development of the continent, and hence NEPAD came into being. Then we saw NEPAD implementing a program called the Short-Term Action Plan, which was the key infrastructure priority program for the continent. Yes. And what you see today in terms of development between countries is really the effort that was made in 2001 to 2010. Now we are moving into a new phase of that very same initiative called the Program for Infrastructure Development. All of this were really as a result of political will. And I can cite a good one close to home, the Presidential Infrastructure Champion Initiative, which, as you know, is led by President Zuma, together with 7 presidents in Africa, shows political will. What I think is lacking, perhaps, is the technocrats. Can they take this political will and try to accelerate infrastructure development? And this is where we are coming.
But you see, you're talking 7, or let me give you 10, perhaps, countries on the continent of 54 states. That is not enough. And I mean, at NEPAD, I know you always like to boast about the what do you call this? The highway from...
The Trans-African highways.
Yes, you know. But it's not happening. Leaders are more worried about their political terms. And even those that have been in office for many, many years have not done enough. You know, there isn't much that you can say, you know, in terms of infrastructure, this is where this country has gone. Because if that was the case, we would be speaking of super economies.
Well, Mpho, I think you need to understand that Africa is not a country, it's a continent.
Correct.
Which means that you are going to deal with the nuances of cross-border issues. The different administrative experiences, cultural experiences, and the different standards, whether it's technical or what have you. So all these years, what NEPAD has been doing, together with its partners, is to really harmonize the regulatory frameworks that connects or that brings countries together. For example, you can travel from West Africa. The whole of West Africa, the axle load is 11.5 ton per axle. And the moment you begin to cross over to Central Africa, it changes. So these are the nuances and challenges that are faced by regional integration. And I must say that in the past, political leaders have really come to the fold by saying that we are harmonizing our frameworks. And it is happening, though I must admit at a slower pace, yes. But it is happening.
Okay. How is poor infrastructure affecting economic development?
Well, in the obvious way that it affects economic growth, because if you have limited economic infrastructure, and we're talking here the basic things, we're talking power capacity, we are talking transport capacity from road, rail to port, to the mix of all of that, to telecommunication and logistical capacity. That is your basic economic infrastructure. If you do not have that, of course, it limits the amount of goods and services you can produce, and that is your GDP. That is the growth rate that you are likely to achieve. It is the rate at which you are likely to employ people, and also the rate at which you are capable of making profits and paying income and salaries and so forth and so forth. So it is important to put the infrastructure in place. So I think often in Africa we have, and especially in South Africa, I think that's what I really should talk about here is South Africa. We have spent billions on infrastructure, on economic infrastructure, but the delivery of the actual product, the actual infrastructure, doesn't actually occur. So you never really lift the constraint on the economy. And once you've actually delivered the infrastructure, it has to hopefully one day reduce the cost of production, which makes Africa more competitive, or African countries more competitive in the global setup.
If Algeria and Nigeria can develop 4,500 kilometers of a road or a highway, what makes it impossible for the DRC to have a road that would link the cities, in that country?
Well, you are citing one very good example of the Presidential Infrastructure Champion Initiative. This is the linkages, the interconnection between Nigeria and Algeria.
Yes.
Now, that's the best case. And I must say we are, in fact, using it as a model, because here you have Algeria coming to the aid of a smaller economy like Niger, and provide the cost of construction for that 200 kilometers of road within Niger, paid by Algerian taxpayers. That's what we are looking for. When you come to the other side of DRC, again, DRC is a subcontinent, if I can say. It's a combination of countries in one. So, and then you have to appreciate, where it is in its development vis-a-vis these two countries you're talking about, Nigeria and Algeria. But put it this way, DRC have the potential to really interconnect its cities, because as you know today, one of the biggest projects that we are all aiming as Africans, or Africa, is to build the Inga Dam.
Yes.
And it is squarely in that very important country. And as you know today, South Africa is working very closely with DRC to try to see how best we can build the Inga 3 project, with most of its resource, power capacity will be directed to Southern Africa and to West Africa through the two connectors. So I would say that in terms of the urban connectivities in DRC, it is just a matter of time, because I think with the aid of NEPAD doing the regional connectivities, governments can now focus their efforts and energy in terms of doing the internal connectivities that will help countries like DRC.
Okay, that's fine. I want us to take a quick break. Perhaps when we return, let's talk about intra-African trade, both within the regions, but also in a country like South Africa, where, as they say, it's a world of 2 or 3 economies. How can we see that into fruition? This question time, please don't worry.
Cities in Africa. There exists a unique and vibrant street culture which dictates the heartbeat of many cities throughout the African continent.
The city of Johannesburg is filled with vibrant scenes of hawking and selling.
This was from overseas. I think it's a donation from overseas now that they're delivering to us.
Further up north, the same experience can be found as eager buyers barter with their hawkers.
The languages may be different, but the similarities are the one common thread that bind us all together as citizens of Africa.
That's Kaleidoscope, Sundays, 5:30 p.m. on SABC News.
Type 1 diabetes happens when your pancreas stops working, so the body does not get insulin anymore.
I have diabetes. My life is changed. I was in a total state.
Too much food, too little exercise. That's what it's about.
Hot flushes. So you would start with lifestyle modification, wearing cotton clothing, eating right, etc. And then hormone treatment for hot flushes.
Join me on Health Talk every Saturday morning between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. as we unpack current health stories.
Welcome back. You're still watching Question Time. My guest today, Adam Adin, is the head of Infrastructure Strategic Business Unit at NAPAD, and Nikki Weimar is the senior economist at Ned Bank. Nikki, let's look at South Africa in particular. Economists have said it's a world of two economies. You've got the first world economy, you also have a third world economy in one country. How do you then deal with this disparity, to try and ensure that this third world economy comes to par with the first world economy?
Yes, obviously we want to lift everybody up to the highest level. But I'm not sure whether I entirely agree with this we've had this forever, the first world economy and the third world economy. If that's unique to us, it's unique to Brazil, it's unique to Chile, it's unique to Mexico, and the list goes on and on and on. It is normal for an emerging market of our nature to have huge income, wealth disparities, also disparities in opportunity, disparities in education. So this sort of setup, as we have it in South Africa, is perfectly normal. I think that from South Africa's perspective, it doesn't make it any less complex. How do you actually get the economy moving, and how do you actually reach the lowest income and wealth bracket of society, and how do you lift them up? And I think it is a combination of strategies, and infrastructure is an element towards that goal. It's not the only thing, but it is certainly an element towards it. In the case of South Africa, we have clearly identified, as we did through the NDP and so forth, many policy documents have identified that infrastructure is actually a constraint of growth. We can today say just the lack of power infrastructure alone will probably shave about 1% of GDP growth in 2015. 1% is significant. It's significant in terms of whether you're growing at 2% or 3%. It's significant in terms of job creation. And we can clearly see that the casualty of the lack of economic infrastructure is really the private sector. So for me, really, if you answer that question, how do you do it? You have to do it from many different levels. It requires effective government. So there is a social dimension to it. There is an educational dimension to it. It has to be effective delivery. It has to reach people. But then obviously from the social economic or social infrastructure is very important. Economic infrastructure, and how do you increase the mobility of people? That it takes them shorter to go and look for work, that it's not as expensive to go and look for work, that they can move about quite easily. All of that helps people to help themselves far more effectively. In the case of Johannesburg, if you live on one side of the country, of the town, and there's a job opportunity on the other, you can move there. It's not cost-wise prohibitive. The other side of it, of course, is you must get the economy to grow. And a large bit of it is government needs to put the key economic infrastructure in place. If it is struggling to do so, then it needs to look at different ways of doing it. In the case of South Africa, I think we've gotten to that point. Maybe it isn't just public corporations or state-owned enterprises that should be looking at putting economic infrastructure. We need to get more creative about it, because delivery is clearly not happening. Because that will allow the private sector to grow, to expand capacity, and it's through that act that you ultimately get employment.
Which industries, though, are the worst affected?
It's your heavy energy users. In South Africa at the moment, it's your heavy energy users. And it's your exporters, those that use transport and logistical infrastructure most severely. And those that are your heavy energy users are, of course, affected by the lack of power capacity. All three of those elements, plus labor in South Africa, which have also become a prohibitive factor, has, of course, pushed up our cost of production. So it is your heavy energy users. If you look at the distribution, National Treasury in the budget produced a very nice little table in which they show who uses the most electricity and who employs the most people. And it isn't actually mining and manufacturing, which are your heavy energy users. They're not the biggest employers. It's more tourism and services in your tertiary sector that are the bigger employers. But clearly, you need to export because you need to earn foreign currency in order to get the imports you need in order to move your economy forward.
Let's talk about regionalization here, Mr. Tim. How will it ensure that there is this infrastructure development that we're talking about?
Well, I think you have to look at it from where we are today in Africa in terms of our interregional trade and regional integration. Africa today fares comparatively in a worse situation compared to its comparative so-called competitors. Take, for example, Africa, in terms of interregional trade, you're talking about just 12% of total trade. The total trade that we create on an annual basis. Intra, between South Africa and Botswana or Gambia and Senegal, that's what we got, compared to 60% in Europe. This is why today the EU is the most highly integrated continent.
Are African countries opening the markets for each other?
They are, but they are saddled with infrastructure deficits. Infrastructure deficits in the area of the transport infrastructure connectivities.
Perhaps in the means of making business also?
Exactly. Means of making business in terms of trade facilitation. You have a lot of issues when it comes to trade facilitation. You can travel from South Africa, going to Zimbabwe or Gambia to Senegal, and then you are faced with different customs procedures. How do you deal with that? So again, you come to the nuances of regional integration, which means that you have to have the likes of NEPAD, AU, to be able to say, we are an independent broker, let's sit together and see how to harmonize these trade regimes so that we can begin to accelerate our objective on regional integration. This is where we are.
Yes, I was going to say exactly that. Sometimes we want the big projects, and the big projects have to happen, but sometimes to facilitate trade is really just to create an environment in which the private sector often will find its own solutions. And red tape and regulation and unpredictable changes to the rules of operation from one country to the other is often even a bigger prohibitor than the actual infrastructure, because very often if the profit incentive is there, the private sector will find a way.
You've got a country like Angola, right? The president is worth billions of dollars. The infrastructure, bad. Yet, we're still complaining. Well, you are saying that, well, the will is there. But I'm willing to say the will is not there.
Well, I would like to disagree with you, and I would say that the will is there for Angola. And I will tell you one thing. If you look at today, Angola is one of the few countries in Africa that have established a sovereign wealth fund to use that resource or wealth to plow it into its development. Again, they have already also adopted what we call, surprisingly, the Angola mode. The Angola mode is a framework that now countries like Angola are using to try to accelerate their infrastructure development by putting into one basket different payment systems. Take, for example, they will cost this particular project, looking at what cash goes in there, what sort of in-kind trades will go there, or even the mineral aspect. They've done this very well with China. Now the World Bank and some of the Bretton Woods institutions are coming in to say that, yes, we know that what we call the emerging 7 economies in the world, for example, Turkey, Brazil, India, and so forth, are now using the Angola mode to accelerate infrastructure development in Africa by moving away from the conventional Washington consensus of having to deal with, a classic model of, implementing a project through a feasibility study, doing all this analysis, and then at the end of the day say, does it have the internal rate of return, and so forth.
Hold the thought there. I want us to take a quick break. This question time, don't go.
Over 20 years now, South Africa has just been one big construction site, building houses.
This is the only country in the world that provides free housing. The government has done very well in this particular area.
What are the challenges facing human settlements?
Most of the people who move into urban centers are looking for jobs, basically, and that increases the pressure in that particular area. We know exactly what needs to be done where and how it should be done.
They were also building houses for married staff, and you had the married quarters and the hostels. And all of that stopped. What happened?
Nothing has stopped, Mr. Mateza. We cannot solve the housing problems on our own in this country. We cannot wait for government as well.
It's a joint venture, if I were to put it like that, between the public sector and the private sector, particularly in the area of mines.
That's Rights and Recourse, Sundays 2 p.m. on SABC News.
You can't have a gut feeling about other people's gut feeling.
Ngaba has continued the tradition of passing stories onto the next generation using a platform that offers stories to a far more greater audience.
Somebody no go unless you tell them to go.
This is what the audiences all over the world knew Fela Kuti for.
Join Musam Khalipi on Afro Showbiz every Saturday at 19:30 CAT.
Welcome back. You're still watching Question Time. My guest today, Ramadeen, Head of Infrastructure Strategic Business Unit at NEPAD, Nikki Verma, the Senior Economist at Nedbank. Let's look at the way forward, Nikki. What needs to happen?
Just in terms of infrastructure?
Yep.
I think in South Africa, certainly, in order to clear up a lot of the doubt, you need a comprehensive energy plan. We have got a plan for expenditure in terms of what will be spent on what types of infrastructure and over what period of time and by whom. But I think the key thing here is that you take energy, for example. We spent over 310 billion rand on Medupi and Kusile. Neither are done. Medupi is almost 3 years overdue. Kusile, I mean, we're not even... It's not even on our frame of reference at this point. So, that's unacceptable. So delivery is an issue. We need to understand, why are we spending these huge sums of money and the actual core asset that we need is never delivered on time and on budget? Which means if it's not on time and on budget, it just makes the entire exercise expensive, and it defeats the purpose of ultimately getting to the point where you have a cost-efficient economy, which it has to feature into the equation. And I think in the case of South Africa, we need to look at what is it we hope to achieve. What we are getting, if we look at some of the commentary that's come out of the Eskom debate, is really that there are so many objectives attached to just delivering key economic infrastructure. And perhaps those objectives can be better served once the economic infrastructure in place. Then you can come with multiple objectives. And the empowerment you're looking for is perhaps a derivative of the infrastructure, not necessarily an integral part of actually delivering the infrastructure.
Infrastructure in which sector?
Well, we need it in key. We have to start with the key economic infrastructure. We have to start with power. We have to start with road, rail, and port. Those are the basic things. As an economy, you can't actually operate unless you have that. So those are the basic things. And after that, also, when you talk about economic infrastructure, it's also important to remember that when you put infrastructure in place, it shouldn't be driven by political objectives. It should be driven by economic objectives. Because if it's driven by political objectives and you're putting infrastructure in an area where a particular politician might get political gain from its existence there, but there's no economic motive for it there, the end result is just that nobody's willing to finance it. Okay. And it just remains this obscure thing that's there on paper and it looks very attractive. Or it is a white elephant at the end of the day. And the apartheid government was guilty of many of those sorts of elements. So it has to be driven by an economic motive. There has to already be economic activity around where you're putting the infrastructure in place.
Mr. Din, why should I believe that as NEPAD you are going to do something about this?
Well, I think the record is there for one to see, because if you look at what I said previously, that the whole infrastructure development in Africa, dating back to 2001, has been a result of a NEPAD framework called the Short-Term Action Plan. We are now getting into the next 30 years of the Regional and Continental Infrastructure Program for Africa called PIDA, the Program for Infrastructure Development. This is where today the African Union, 54 member states, and the 8 RECs, regional economic communities, have agreed to an expenditure of $68 billion to take infrastructure from where it is today to 2020 and impact on its inclusive growth and regional integration.
Are you including young people then? Because young people are not interested in 2030, 2060 vision. They want things to happen now.
Well, obviously, you know, infrastructure cannot develop without the new generation. But again, as you know, infrastructure is a long-term proposition. So what that means is that you will have to bring in the youth, give them training and education, and be able to mold them to understand what is out there in the future. I think we cannot, recall, so to speak, infrastructure development immediately to a point where you can provide short-term gains. But I think in terms of the long-term development that we have set for ourselves, the youth employment issue, and not only the youth, but also the disadvantaged women and so forth, would see themselves in there, because that will create the kind of jobs that we would like to see in terms of creating the inclusive agenda and growth that we are looking for in Africa.
Adamadin Nikovoima, thank you very much for the time. That was Question Time for today. A big thank you to our guests and to you for watching the show. Welcome your feedback via email, questiontime@sabc.co.za, Twitter handle @questiontime24. You can also follow me on Twitter @MportSaidi. From me and the crew, have yourself a wonderful time. Goodbye.